The Unquiet Dead, Anarchism, Fascism, and Mythology. 4. The White Goddess, Essentialism, and the Land. Produced by Resonance, an anarchist audio distro. I have felt troubled for some time over some white feminist practice and advocacy of essentialist nature spiritualities. This tendency is certainly not limited to feminists, but I find it most upsetting as it is performed by them. The political deployment of a belief structure under the premise of sisterhood can be insidious. If we are against fascism, we must ask in what ways we are replicating its themes in our struggle for freedom, and how we may fight that tendency. I write not as part of a relentless drift towards inertia, the enforcement of identity politics that prevents movement. Rather, I want to examine the real friction present between white feminists and those they are trying to save. Essentialism has poisoned our common well for too long. While I do not wish to affirm the social construction of racial difference, I feel a difference in tone around these practices. When they are performed by people of color from the cultures that originated them, they tend to resonate as cultural reclamation or reinvention. When they are done by whites, they feel like cultural appropriation and a deepening colonization, or else as a disturbing appeal to elements of white history that are far from innocent. Footnote. Obviously, there is a third category of people here, non-white people who rely upon spiritual practices from cultures not their own. While I think this can also be problematic, it is not my specific area of critique, because white supremacy charges white appropriations with far more destructive power in our culture. Of course, my perception of these practices is founded in my political alignment. The right sees white practices along these lines as either laughable or the exercise of white rights, and actions as people of color as fearful signs that they are building an insurrection. However, let us refuse pretended objectivity. I choose solidarity, complexity, and uncertainty instead. When the goddess becomes a white woman, is she any less terrifying than the Christian God? And if so, is that not a reaffirmation of essentialist misogyny? How can we approach issues of gender, race, spirituality, and the natural world without reinforcing the oppressive constructs inherent in each? How can white people show real solidarity to those with marginalized histories, the kind of solidarity that changes our mutual present? How can people of color engaged in resistance to white supremacy and efforts towards self-actualization be recognized in ways that do not prop up racial difference or assimilationist enclosure? Perhaps these issues seem less important when they are related to issues of spirituality or self-definition than when they come up in contexts more transparently to do with violence or money. I do not think they are. I do not think there is really much difference. Context. I am using nature spiritualities as a consciously inadequate umbrella term for a diverse and often contradictory array of appropriated spiritual practices, as performed in North America, but drawn from a variety of continents. They include indigenous North American beliefs and European witchcraft, Caribbean witchcraft, some Hindi beliefs, Buddhism, indigenous African beliefs, and more. Characteristics that seem to appeal to these appropriators include 1. The practice or belief comes from a non-Abrahamic background, that is, it is not Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, although some heretical beliefs from those traditions are treated as acceptable sites of appropriation. 2. The belief system includes goddess worship, and/or the practice is woman-centric. 3. The belief system is oriented towards a sense of connection to the land, to plants and animals, to the cycles of the seasons, and asserts itself as a natural, true, older form of belief. 4. The belief system has many ritual practices and does not strictly require the specific exclusion of certain types of behavior, but rather encourages certain ways of thinking. For example, not the strict sexual prohibitions of Christianity or Islam, but sexual ritualism and/or an idea of sex as a healing and natural practice of embodiment, the creation of life, and an affirmation of gender roles. By appropriation, I mean the use of cultural, spiritual, and historical frameworks, artifacts, beliefs, aesthetics, and practices by someone who, A, is not from that culture, B is from an intersectionally elevated position in relation to that culture. C is acting out of ignorance, an acquisitive urge, and, most likely, good intentions. Appropriation is most easily distinguished from cultural exchange, which can be beautiful and aids in building solidarity, by asking a series of questions. Was the exchange initiated by the person who holds less social power? Does the outsider have a genuine and respectful interest in the culture based on real experiences and relationships with people from that culture and/or living in their area? Does the outsider take meaningful political and social action in solidarity with the people whose cultural practices they have adopted, or are they strictly interested in the low-commitment, fun parts? This distinction is necessarily situational, flexible, and subjective to the participants. My critiques are US-centric, although I discuss a Canadian example as well. This is not an attempt to localize the problem, but a reflection of my personal limits of understanding and the demands of space and time. White feminism is heavily complicit in the reactionary efforts against the end of white Europe, for example, efforts such as prohibiting migration into European countries on the premise of saving their enlightened cultures from misogynist ones, who are coincidentally often brown, Muslim, or otherwise outside the Western European mainstream. I am happy to see that some others are doing that critical work. Footnote. Jasbir Puar's Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, a point of reference for this whole text, has a good overview of these critiques. The White Goddess. Quote, "And now at last it comes. You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark but beautiful and terrible as the morning and night, fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair." Fictional white proto-goddess Galadriel. The spiritual. The resurgence of the goddess movement in the United States began over 40 years ago. I have returned to its origin documents in this section to best understand its motives and self-image. I am aware that means I am somewhat unfairly analyzing these writings with the aid of 40 years of theoretical development since they were published. Still, Foucault had published half his work by 1970 and was lecturing at the Collège de France about biopolitics during that decade. Audre Lorde was writing, speaking, and engaging as a queer person of color within the feminist community at this time, and Bell Hooks was writing Ain't I a Woman as an undergraduate. I do not think it is so unfair to use the theoretical frameworks popularized by these writers to critique their peers. Moreover, while the white goddess movement has surely evolved, the trends I find most problematic within it seem to have changed very little. I will illustrate them with a few examples from the anthology Woman Spirit Rising, originally published in 1971. The white women's spirituality movement began as a revolution against the insidious way patriarchy affects Western values and perceptions. To live within a religion, or even to be surrounded by participants of that religion, that explicitly and implicitly describes women as lesser, subordinate, and essentially feminine, is to suffer violence. This violence is not only psychological, but material. Silvia Federici has brilliantly demonstrated the ways in which the exclusion of women from social and political life through the spread of Christianity and the invention of witchcraft as a means of othering powerful women was necessary to the material enclosure of Europe during the feudal stage. This process served as a prerequisite for capitalism. As part of the larger second wave of feminism, women in the 1970s sought to either abandon or to critique and reform Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. It is this we are concerned with, not the turn towards atheism, but the re-establishment of woman-centric religion. As I wish to critique the ways in which this movement betrayed its own aims, I will review some of the goals listed in the introduction of this anthology of primary essays. To oppose a dualistic worldview, man, woman, natural, artificial. To center experience rather than eminence, following the joyful and liberating experience many had in consciousness-raising groups. To center women's bodies and their material interactions with the world. To either reinvent the past through conscious revisionist history, or to create entirely new traditions, to relate to oneself and one's gender as part of the natural world, and or to seek freedom and self-determination apart from determining one's own nature. There are obvious dialectical tensions between these goals, and I am not the first to have noticed them. As to the latter point, Christ in Plaskow's introduction asserts, quote, "The sense of closeness to nature that some women experience in nature mysticism or in the cycles of their bodies, in menstruation, pregnancy, and birth, have much to teach all women and men about the rootedness of the human condition and the natural order. But a focus on women's closeness to nature also has its dangers. In traditional theology and philosophy, women have been equated with nature and men with freedom and transcendence. The new focus on women and nature elevates that which traditional theology and culture have denigrated, but it does not always offer resources to understand those elements of freedom and transcendence of nature which are also part of the human condition in general and feminist experience, such as, for example, the freedom to decide not to have children rather than to be bound to one's biology, the freedom to know oneself as not heterosexual, or, indeed, to know oneself as a woman at all. I am interested in exploring this tension between nature and freedom and the possibility of abolishing this and all other dualisms. I do not think women, or any people, must actually choose between nature and freedom. No one is outside nature. But when people use the word nature, it is often as a cloak for weaponized politics, and many feminists have asserted feminine nature at the great expense of human freedom. In Valerie Savine's essay, The Human Situation, A Feminine View, she asks, quote, "Is there such a thing as an underlying feminine character structure which always and everywhere differs from the basic character structure of the male? Are not all distinctions between the sexes, except the purely biological ones, relative to a given culture?" She answers her question by returning to objective facts about human reproduction and human sexuality that are based in her own cultural biases and ciscentrism, drawing psychological and social conclusions from the processes of puberty, menstruation, and sexuality. Footnote. Cis. To feel at home in one's gendered body, to not be transgender, genderqueer, intersex, or otherwise gender divergent. That is, either a term that applies to very few people or to the majority of people, depending upon your analysis. A sample. Quote, "The process of impregnation, pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation are things which happen to a woman more than things she does. The sexual act, for example, has for her this basically passive quality. In the extreme case, rape, the passive structure of female sexuality unquestionably appears." This essay does more to demonstrate the poverty of Savine's experience than anything fundamental about gendered experience or female nature. She draws from these blandly stated facts conclusions such as, quote, "Masculinity is an endless process of becoming, while in femininity the emphasis is on being," and, quote, "Perhaps the goal we should set ourselves is to rear our daughters in the older way without too much formal education. If we could do this, our daughters might be able to find secure fulfillment in a simple femininity. After all, the division of labor between the sexes worked fairly well for thousands of years, and we may only be asking for trouble by trying to modify that structure." Savine's effort is in direct conflict with the previously stated goal of valuing experience over eminence. Rather, it generalizes about women's experiences, places them as eminent, being as opposed to becoming, and creates a new standard by which to validate or deny women's lives. These sad and pathetic goals, or updated, empowered versions, are the sorts of conclusions we can expect from attempts to explore and define women's essential nature. But there is a different feminist project, one that seeks to explore and question our material realities as a path towards total liberation. Its inquiries include questions like, how can we free people to transcend the socially constructed boundaries of gender, men as well as women? How can we definitively destroy what it means to be gendered in terms of how it imprisons us, does violence to us, defines us against our will? How do these forces operate in tandem with racism to most violently affect women of color? There is also still the question of what this is all for, of what difference it makes beyond personal empowerment. Consciousness-raising groups used to be frequently cited as a place of political joy, of community empowerment for women. Quote, naming experience and recognizing that it is shared is liberating and energizing. Many women experience a kind of rebirth through consciousness-raising and feel that feminism has allowed them to live authentically for the first time in their lives. The feeling of release that comes from casting off men's definitions of women within a community of other women is the source of the early feminist slogan, "Sisterhood is powerful." But what does one do with that power? The civil rights victories won by first and second wave feminists have never been completed. Structural misogyny in the form of the wage gap and access to career opportunities, not to mention misogynist violence, still remains. While feminists aided in the gay liberation movement, the relationship between the two was, and remains, deeply problematic. The movement against domestic violence, started by women of color, was originally one of the most radical and patriarchy-challenging feminist struggles in the U.S. Sadly, it has become far removed from its roots in women making places of safety and protection for each other, so institutionalized that many women I worked with at a domestic violence shelter found it little better in terms of oppressive power structures than the situations from which they had escaped. For the well-off white cis women of America, the victory achieved by the consciousness-raising group is its replacement by less overtly political forms, careers, entertainment, and private forms of spirituality and personal empowerment. To feel liberated is simply to have greater access to privilege, thus implicitly oppressing others, unless you turn to help those further ensnared in chains. Today, the impulse towards solidarity with those most oppressed by patriarchy seems like a relic of a lost era. This is particularly the case for white women when confronted by women whose experiences do not exactly correspond with their own. White feminists of that era, and certainly some continue to do this today, consistently made the embarrassing racist mistake of contrasting and comparing all women with all people of color, as if women of color do not even exist. Footnote: see Bell Hook's path-opening work, Ain't I a Woman, for thorough exploration of this phenomenon. Moreover, in their attempts to recognize the feminine divine in the past, to rediscover witchcraft and nature-oriented spiritualities, they have frequently appropriated and tokenized the cultures and spiritualities of indigenous people of the present or imagined past. Imagined, I would argue, even if they are justified with historical and anthropological narratives. Frequently, these white feminists barely cite actual examples of women's lives or spiritual practices within particular cultures, but vaguely refer instead to the cultural imaginary of the noble savage. This tendency contains fairly fetishistic implications, even if it comes from simply seeking nature spirituality as the negation of Abrahamic religions. Through an anti-colonialist lens, it amounts to something like, first, we murder and try to suppress you, devouring your resources and labor. Later, we regurgitate your remains for a second digestion, trying to recreate your remnants for their pleasurable taste. When we level this critique, we are told that at least it is better than eliding women of color from history, as if those were the only choices. If white women, to use the falsely monolithic language of these feminists, claim some innocence from the first by virtue of their past exclusion from public life, an extremely dubious claim, as resistance and solidarity is practiced by those in the worst circumstances, they certainly cannot claim any innocence from the second. These two aspects of racism occurring simultaneously within white feminism are no coincidence to me. White feminists who have come to consciousness about their oppression as women, but not about their participation in white supremacy, will make this mistake over and over again. Their entitlement to the lives of others belies their understanding of how they themselves have been oppressed and their claims to solidarity on that basis. While there are endless examples of explicitly racist and colonialist appropriation and ignorance, white feminist silence around the experiences of women of color show the problem even more clearly than accidentally out loud racist remarks uttered within polite society. This silence also manifests as an action. Third-wave feminism, through the work of feminists of color, has done much to center race within feminist discourse, but there is a dearth of actual solidarity from white women these days. For example, the lack of white feminist projects addressing the oppression of incarcerated women of color in the U.S. It is easier, apparently, to make your praxis at the intersection of race and gender to be about the imagined suffering of Muslim women under hijab, or of girls in other countries who undergo female circumcision or female genital mutilation, than it is to address the suffering for which you are directly responsible as a participant in your own community's white supremacy and misogyny. This tendency to simultaneously exclude and exoticize, to other and to want the other, in whatever coded and veiled forms, is at the heart of white supremacy as well as misogyny. It is founded in essentialism, and it is this I feel white feminists are returning to in their well-meaning attempts to locate and worship the goddess, or the feminine in nature, or the feminine nature. When the goddess is white, how is she any less terrifying an image than a white god in a white supremacist society? To assert she must necessarily be a kinder, more loving, more naturally attuned divine presence is to be out of touch with the ways in which women have hurt each other along lines of race, sex, and gender conformity. Because we have lived within a patriarchal society all our lives, it is tempting to believe that women are only victims, but to do so is itself misogynist. Women are no less capable of abusing power than men in their essence, as opposed to in our shared material conditions, which do tend to favor men. Although the point at which any assertion becomes general is the point at which it is no longer true. Any specific man might be more injured by our reality than any specific woman. The supposedly liberatory goddess of white feminist creation is based in the imagined mythic rather than in the material experience of our lives. And how often has what people imagine the feminine to be materially hurt women? This has not created an image of divinity that reflects women's experiences. It is a simple replacement of the imaginary father with the imaginary mother, with equal authoritarian force no less abusive than its male-coded form. In her essay, Mother Earth and the Mega Machine, A Theology of Liberation in a Feminine, Somatic, and Ecological Perspective, Rosemary Bradford Butler almost immediately describes proto-fascist movement as the enemy of women. Quote, "The reaction against and suppression of the women's liberation movement has been closely tied to reactionary cultural and political movements, and the emancipated woman has been the chief target of elitism, fascism, and neoconservatism of all kinds. The Romantic movement traumatized Europe's reaction to the French Revolution, reinstated the traditional view of women in idealized form, while the more virulent blood and soil reactionaries of the 19th century expressed a more naked misogynism. I concur. But she fails to learn her own lesson. The main thrust of her essay is that we should all return to what anthropologists and historians portray as a nature-oriented, holistic spirituality. This is exactly what the Volkish ideologues who promoted blood and soil strife called for. The two differ only in their beliefs about the role of women in such a society. Footnote. In fact, Nazis were not above promising gifts of empowerment to women who cooperated with them when times were desperate. Goebbels made such a pledge in his Total War speech. Her work is interesting in that it indicts civilization as a whole for its destruction of the wild, enclosure, and misogyny, but falls dramatically short in addressing those issues in our present reality, calling instead for a return to the natural. It is hypocritical to decry the Nazis from one side of your mouth while echoing their views from the other, even if you have replaced Aryan men with racially nonspecific, but, given your lack of specificity and personal placement, probably white, women as your natural subject. I call for a turning away from these issues of nature, essence, and the search for validation in a reconstruction of the divine. Instead, I celebrate the occasional return of feminism to the material, to real solidarity, to internationalism, and to local struggle. While we may find our individual spiritualities helpful in the struggle, the thing itself must not be based in a mythology of the divine, but in our shared, diverse experiences. If sisterhood is powerful, as people found in their early experiences of consciousness-raising groups, let us use that power not only for self-directed empowerment, or for dressing up in the rituals we have stolen from others, but for actual liberation. And while I use we aspirationally to evoke the sort of solidarity and community we would all like to see among feminists, let me be clear. This is a call to white, cis feminists in particular. Refuse to become the oppressors you have long resisted. no matter how good the bribe. The political. In hopes of moving through and out of the negative aspects of feminism towards its potential for freedom, I will begin with betrayal, move to solidarity, and end with revolt. Betrayal. Mary Daly is one of the pioneers of radical feminism. Her writing has been incredibly influential to the movement, if also quite controversial. While I will not attempt to cover her work in depth, I wish to compare two aspects of her politics that I find contradictory: her avowed rejection of patriarchal spirituality and her intense transphobia. In her 1971 essay, After the Death of God the Father, Women's Liberation and the Transformation of Women's Consciousness, Daly reviews the accomplishments of the women's liberation movement around spirituality and proposes future work. She suggests that feminists have made an incomplete critique of patriarchal elements within Christianity to understand its call towards transcendence, which uses the idea of God to, quote, legitimate oppression, particularly that of women. These are irredeemably anti-feminine and therefore anti-human. The end of women's oppression, far from being necessarily atheist, could mean a greater closeness between humans and the divine. Quote, the becoming of women may not only be the doorway to deliverance from the omnipotent Father in all of his disguises, a deliverance which secular humanism has passionately fought for, but also a doorway to something, that is, the beginning for many of a more authentic search for transcendence, that is, for God. She argues that Christianity has divided the sexes and sought to assign activity and sin to men and passivity and virtue to women, thus simultaneously disenfranchising men from their ability to be passive and or virtuous, and women from their abilities to actively liberate themselves. Quote, this emphasis upon the passive virtues, of course, has not challenged exploitativeness but supported it. Part of the syndrome is the prevailing notion of sin as an offense against those in power, or against God. The two are often equated. She calls not only for women to take up their power, but for men to seek to free themselves from the chains of gendered expectations. Importantly, she calls also for an extension of these analyses beyond the lines of gender. Quote, the consciousness raising which is beginning among women is evoking a qualitatively new understanding of the subtle mechanisms which produce and destroy the other, and a consequent empathy with all of the oppressed. This gives grounds for the hope their emergence can generate a counterforce to the exploitative mentality which is destroying persons and the environment. The work of fostering religious consciousness, which is explicitly incompatible with sexism, will require an extraordinary degree of creative rage, love, and hope. I am largely in concurrence with this essay's critique of Christianity. I am pleased by how her analysis understands men to also be, however differently, entrapped by gender, and by how she calls for the extension of one's raised consciousness to include understanding, solidarity, and creative rage in the deconstruction of society. That appreciation and sense of connection makes her later, horrifying, hateful attacks on trans women that much more shocking. This intimate betrayal on the part of cis feminists is very common, but still not easy to bear. Daly's 1978 work, Gyne Ecology, The Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism, is most notable for the style in which it is written. A dreamy mix of non-standard spellings and capitalizations, pagan imagery, and in-depth coverage of various misogynist horrors, which, not incidentally, she mostly cites as occurring within non-white cultures. Mixed in with her outrage about African genital mutilation, the unspeakable atrocities, foot binding, and sati, Daly manages to call out transsexualism 8 times. An example, quote, Dionysus sometimes assumed a girl-like form. The phenomenon of the drag queen dramatically demonstrates such boundary violations. Like White's plain blackface, he incorporates the oppressed role without being incorporated in it. She continues, following noted transphobe Janice Raymond, quote, the majority of transsexuals are male to female, while transsexed females basically function as tokens and are used by the rulers of the transsexual empire to hide the real nature of the game. The surgeons and hormone therapists of the transsexual kingdom in their effort to give birth, can be said to produce feminine persons. They cannot produce women. Just as Sandy Stone answered Janice Raymond's accusations about the transsexual empire in her important piece, The Empire Strikes Back, the gender studies scholar Susan Stryker has brilliantly answered and transcended Mary Daly's accusations of monstrosity in her piece, Letter to Dr. Frankenstein. I will not attempt to recreate their work, nor am I capable of doing so. I wish to only briefly highlight some of Daly's most flagrant betrayals of her own politics. The impulse to guard the garden of oppression is a strange one. Having come together and shared stories of common pain, conscious people often turn inwards and become vicious to one another. Sometimes this is legitimate, hearing someone reflect your own pain back at you, then hearing them betray you in the next breath is painful and deserves critique. Often, however, it means recreating the same power dynamics you are in struggle against. This is what happened for American cis feminists vis-a-vis trans women in the great wars of the 1970s and 1980s. Daly, Raymond, and others regard trans women as male pretenders. Quote, like whites playing blackface, he incorporates the oppressed role without being incorporated in it. Besides its offensive and invisibilizing equation of racism and alleged misogyny, this statement reflects a willful ignorance of the violent oppression trans women face, a violence statistically much more deadly than it is for the average cis woman. Additionally, why would anyone want to steal the oppressed role? For someone to out herself as a potential target of misogyny when she need not experience it in the most direct of ways, although living closeted is its own particular hell, her experience of womanhood may be, if anything, particularly necessary, particularly essential, if you must. Daly makes no attempt to reflect on this, preferring instead to police the boundaries of womanhood. In doing so, she joins the ranks of patriarchal oppression, allying herself with her supposed enemies. While in her earlier essay, God the Father, she called for feminists to welcome the other, and to see othering as a fundamental part of women's oppression, she makes no effort to do so herself here. Daly claims an essential knowledge of womanhood in her statement that doctors cannot produce women. I do not even disagree with her on that particular, because I believe womanhood is not dependent on surgeries or vaginas or estrogen levels. I know this from my experience as a trans person, from my solidarity with and love for particular trans feminine people, and from my political understanding that we are all collections of constructions, identities, experiences, and bodies. I know that being a woman is dependent far more on one's identity as such than on one's body and material experience, that trans feminine bodies are women's bodies, no matter how their bodies are constituted, and that trans women often live the material reality of struggling to survive the cutting edge of misogynist violence. It is a massive failure on the part of cis feminists like Daly that they are part of inflicting, rather than opposing, this misogyny. Her practical wrongness about the function of trans men as tokens is interesting. Most queers will tell you that, these days, there are more visible transmasculine people than transfeminine people, and that we take up far more space replicating the patterns of patriarchy. In my view, trans men do this not only because of a reproduction of learned masculinity, which, in this culture, is already always enclosed by patriarchy, but also because, sometimes, trans men implicitly feel themselves to be the exception to the rule, that because they grew up being perceived as, and perhaps socialized as female, they cannot now transgress against women, need not hold themselves to the same standards as cis men. This problem is similar to the mistake Daly is making. It is the unconsciously held belief that, having once come to consciousness about one's own oppression, one cannot in turn oppress others. I think that this is also near the heart of white feminist racism. Transphobia against trans men also comes from this logic. In Patrice Jones's book, Aftershock, Confronting Trauma in a Violent World, she makes the following wild claim. Quote, between 1910 and 1920, over 500,000 people in the United States passed into whiteness by changing their self-designated race. Nowadays, more and more young women, having learned what happens to girls in today's world, are literally turning themselves into men to protect themselves from violation. And, of course, the majority of us side with the butcher rather than risk being made into meat. While, as I said, I want to hold trans men as accountable for their alliances with patriarchy as I do cis men, The idea that trans men transition only to gain male privilege is an expression of the same sad tendency to guard the garden of oppression. In this case, judging from Jones's self-definition, probably the lesbian community, it is especially shameful in a work that purports to be a tool for people who have experienced trauma. The comparison both authors make to racial boundary crossing is concerning. It is no doubt an inheritance of the white feminist tendency to compare the struggles of women and people of color. I think it is a little worse than that, however, a kind of peculiar fascination with the transgressions of boundaries, the unresolved horror at the heart of fearing the other. Daly compares female genital mutilation / female circumcision to the genital surgery some trans women choose to have. Quote, "It is interesting to compare these attempts to feminize women via FGM with the feminization of male to constructed female transsexuals. The latter, who consider themselves to be women, referring to other women as native women." Footnote, in my many years of experience within the trans community, I have never heard such a thing, and I'm inclined to think Daly invented it. Undergo operations which remove the testicles and penis and give them artificial vaginas, but no clitoris. Both of these mutilating attempts at feminization receive a large amount of legitimation by phallocracy. What she means by a large amount of legitimation by phallocracy in the case of trans women, I can barely imagine. Does the daily bread of murder, hatred, and marginalization inflicted upon trans women count as legitimation in her eyes? In any case, her deployment of the white cis gaze upon genitals under the guise of pseudoscientific interests is disturbing. She covers sati, Chinese foot binding, and African female genital mutilation, all with the same sort of horrified fascination she directs at American trans women. For Daly, the essence of being a woman seems to be scrutinizing other women for signs of abnormality while using herself as a standard. Solidarity. Starhawk has been a member of pagan and activist communities since the 1980s. She has written several influential books. I examined just one, Dancing the Dark. Starhawk's work is centered around the healing of self in conjunction with healing of the world. She believes that our society is sick and our earth endangered because of harmful views we hold of ourselves, and that one can use pagan magic and activism to change all three. Her work transcends several of my critiques of white feminist practitioners of nature spiritualities, though not all of them. Starhawk argues that our current social situation is one of estrangement, perhaps what Marx would call alienation, of people from the material world. Her alternate proposal relies upon a rejection of duality. Under Christianity, quote, "Flesh, nature, woman, and sexuality are identified with the devil and the forces of evil. God was envisioned as male, uncontaminated by the processes of birth, nurturing, growth, menstruation, and the decay of the flesh. He was removed from this world into a transcendent realm of spirit somewhere else. More fundamentally, she sees the good guys and girls against the bad guys and girls as one of the basic frameworks of estrangement. Quote, "Light is idealized and dark is devalued in the story that permeates our culture. The war of dark and light is the metaphor that perpetrates racism. The light-dark metaphor was the underlying theme of Nazi propaganda. The same splitting of light and dark buttresses the splitting of spirit, light, and body, dark, of male and female, of culture and nature. The split becomes the metaphor of hierarchy. It supports power over. Beware of organizations that proclaim their devotion to the light without embracing, bowing to the dark. For when they idealize half the world, they must devalue the rest." She is expressing a fundamentally anti-essentialist perspective here. Essentialism relies upon duality, the splitting process by which othering is made possible. Starhawk envisions a healthy pagan spiritual understanding as one that unites the spiritual and the physical and defies gendered understandings of corresponding concepts. This framework would oppose the dualistic estrangement that enables domination and othering, drawing instead upon a unified identity and worldview. Quote, "We are most familiar with power over, with structures of domination and control that derive ultimately from a worldview that removes sacred value from the earth and from the cycles of birth and death. In this book, I identify a different sort of power I call power from within, akin to the root meaning of power as ability, and derived from the recognition that each of us has eminent social value. This definition of eminence amounts more to an argument for personal autonomy in Starhawk's work than as an essentialist call for refusing action and transformation, as it did in Rosemary Butler's work. Starhawk uses gendered and personified symbols of worship, goddess and god, and feels that this gendering is important as an answer to patriarchy. Quote, "The female image of divinity does not provide a justification for the oppression of men. The female, who gives birth to the male, includes the male in a way that male divinities cannot include the female." This giving birth metaphor is, sadly, body-dependent. However, she explicitly rejects the worst possibilities of goddess worship. Quote, "I recognize that there is a danger in the use of any symbol, that people will forget the principles it represents. The goddess could be taken as an object of external worship in a context no less hierarchical and oppressive than that of any religion of patriarchy. Let us be clear that when I say goddess, I am not talking about a being somewhere outside of this world, nor am I proposing a new belief system. I am talking about choosing an attitude, choosing to take this living world, the people and creatures on it, as the ultimate meaning and purpose of life, to see the world, the earth, and our lives as sacred." While she continues to rely on gendered and body-dependent metaphors throughout her book, she tends to complicate or differently slant them, as when she describes how, in her view, worshipping a maternal force necessarily means supporting access to abortions. Importantly, she critiques the family as the smallest unit of oppression, rather than uncritically drawing on it as a site of female exaltation, as did Valerie Saving. Starhawk falls occasionally in what might be considered noble savage rhetoric. Quote, "The room in which I sit is different from a house belonging to one of the Dogon people in Africa, where every space has a ritual, symbolic meaning as part of a human body, and different from a teepee of the Plains Indians, built to be transported as part of the cycles of migration. This room is an object in a world of separate, isolated objects. The Dogon house and the teepee are sets of relationships in a world of interwoven processes." Although social understandings do, obviously, shape our material environment, and capitalism is dependent on alienation, from a worker's perspective, the modern American home is just as much a set of relationships in a world of interwoven processes, not fundamentally different from these other structures, just existing within an atmosphere of outright coercion. Starhawk is here lazily relying upon the liberal assumption that non-white or non-capitalist lifestyles are fundamentally superior. For the most part, though, I feel that she pays respectful attention, rather than appropriates, in her references to indigenous cultures, although my judgment, as a non-indigenous person, is necessarily limited. Rather ominously, Starhawk notes that, "In Europe the old cultures rise again, the empires come apart at the seams." She makes positive reference to a series of pre-empire white cultures, with seemingly no idea of the last time older white cultures were evoked in Europe in terms of resisting empire. This, after just pages earlier describing her actual San Francisco neighborhood with pleasure in its diversity, which I find a more inspiring and useful reference point. She continues, quote, "In the southwest of the United States, in the Black Hills, the Indian tribes still fight to survive. Perhaps it is time for all of us to reconsider our loyalties, to consider what might further human survival. Our work is not just sawing the legs off the ladders, but building the structures that replace them." Probably what she means here is supporting indigenous sovereignty rather than anything more like fascism, but she does so fairly uncritically. Still, I think Starhawk is speaking in good faith, if foolishly. Starhawk's model of a ritual circle begins with all of the participants focusing on their goals for changing their lives and the world for the better, and ends with everyone voicing a step they will take for advancing their goals. This is already more oriented towards action than most of what we have previously considered. Also, it means that each religious practice is more constituted of the needs and experiences of its participants than of attendance to a pre-agreed set of principles. In this way, it resembles a reflective meeting to accomplish individual and community goals more than religious duty. Furthermore, Starhawk's spirituality and life approach is in general one of political action. She describes doing various rituals as means of practicing conflict against various forces, largely nuclear bases. She speaks of this through goddess metaphor. Quote, In this action, we become Persephone as we are dragged off by the forces of patriarchy to do our time in the underworld and then emerge again. We become Demeter, who sits at the gate, who rends her clothes and says, "This cannot go on." Quote, "It is categories in the mind and guns in the hands that keep us enslaved." Somehow, facing the guns in their hands makes it clear to us which categories in our minds are their agents. I have grown used to thinking of policemen as my friends. Here, however, it is very clear that the powers of the police, the courts, and the military are at one with the nuclear power industry, with all the forms of power that threaten to poison these oaks, this ocean, our living human bodies. This is obvious when the police have dragged me away and locked me up, oblivious to my sore wrists and skinned knees. Not that I mind having skinned knees. It adds to that sense of being a child again, even though the stakes here are not playful, but too real. Here, frustration is gone. I feel like a victim released by a vampire. My blood is my own again. What has freed me is action. I have acted with my body, using not just words, but my whole being. I have become fully a part of this community of resistance, putting forth effort and taking risks. To be present with skills and patience I have for listening, for evoking feelings, for soothing hurts, for saying the right thing, and for knowing when to shut up is healing. It is the only spiritual discipline that makes sense to me in a nuclear age. Starhawk intertwines her spiritual, political, and personal actions such that each supports the other. Conflictual action is not left out of the equation, as it so often is by the privileged. She is aware of her privilege, also. She describes dancing naked with 200 women in jail from a protest, and the uneasy mix of exhilaration and fear she experiences around deliberately performing such an act while in jail. She reflects, quote, "We dance, knowing that we are allowed this as a privilege, as so much of what has been good in our lives is a privilege, knowing that women who are in jail alone, who are not white, who do not have a movement and a legal team behind them, whose stories are not of interest to the newspapers, cannot dance, cannot go naked, may be raped and brutalized, not smiled at by the guards. Yet we dance because this is, after all, what we are fighting for. This life, these bodies, breasts, wombs, the smell of flesh, this joy, this freedom, that it continue, that it prevail." Although I am not aware of specific work Starhawk has done in solidarity with prisoners, this is, at least, acknowledgement of their struggle. While I think Starhawk's framework, understanding, and impulse towards action are all stronger than those I have previously reviewed, I can only hope that her understanding contributes to a real widening of solidarity, one that destroys borders of privilege between people more than it strengthens them through the use of identity. Revolt. One last white feminist who evokes the goddess, Monique Wittig. She was foundational to French materialist feminism and was publicly anti-essentialist before that critique entered mainstream feminist discourse. She joins these two lines of thought by arguing that gender is a social construction, but one reinforced by material oppression that tends to fall along gendered lines, although those lines are fluid. She joined many other less academic feminists in critiquing essentialism in her essay, One is Not Born a Woman, the title drawn from Simone de Beauvoir's originary work, The Second Sex. Famously, she says that a heterosexist society is necessary for the maintenance of gender, since the idea of woman as a deviation from the idea of man flows from this created, oppressive duality. She argues that lesbians are not, therefore, properly women. Footnote. Puar would no doubt argue that, while this is the case for a time, white lesbians who have agreed to participate in capitalist America have now been welcomed into heterosexist society. She therefore suggests the radical abolition of traditional gendered understanding. Quote, "What does feminist mean? Feminist is formed with the word femme, woman, and means someone who fights for women. For many of us, it means someone who fights for women as a class and for the disappearance of this class. For many others, it means someone who fights for woman and her defense, for the myth then, and its reinforcement." She observes that essentialism is also necessary for the production of race in our society. Quote, "What we take for the cause or origin of oppression is in fact only the mark imposed by the oppressor. the myth of woman plus its material effects and manifestations in the appropriated consciousness and bodies of women. Thus, this mark does not predate oppression. Colette Guillamine has shown that before the socio-economic reality of black slavery, the concept of race did not exist, at least not in its modern meaning, since it was applied to the lineage of families. However, now, race, exactly like sex, is taken as an immediate given, a sensible given, physical features belonging to a natural order. But what we believe to be a physical and direct perception is only a sophisticated and mythic construction, an imaginary formation, which reinterprets physical features, in themselves as neutral as any others, but marked by the social system, through the network of relationships in which they are perceived. They are seen as black, therefore they are black. They are seen as women, therefore they are women. But before being seen that way, they first had to be made that way. Here, Wittig does not quite fall into the classic white feminist trap of invisibilizing black women by comparing black and female experience, as if the two could not be shared by the same person, but she skates perilously close by not explicitly acknowledging it. Knowing that the rationale for power acting on bodies is a socially constructed one is not enough to prevent one from doing the same. Still, her highlighting of the construction of difference is useful. Wittig's novel Les Guerrières, published in 1969, is a revolutionary and romantic call to erase our predicates, and has been greatly misunderstood as a text that affirms essentialism. It is a disconnected story of a violent war against patriarchy by, from the view of the English translation, women. It takes the form of dreamy prose, lists of women's names mixed with paragraphs that convey information in the form, the women say. However, here at this very fundamental level lies an important translation error. Wittig intentionally wrote her book with the French pronoun elle, a gender-neutral pronoun for which the closest English equivalent is they. She strongly objected to the translator's use of the women instead. Footnote. Nevertheless, I have abided by the English translation's use of the women in my quotations. From Wittig's essay, The Mark of Gender, quote, when elle is turned into the women, the process of universalization is destroyed. All of a sudden, elle stopped being mankind. Not only was my undertaking with the collective pronoun elle lost, but another word was introduced, the word women appearing obsessively throughout the text, and it is one of those gender-marked words mentioned earlier which I never use in French. For me, it is the equivalent of slave, and in fact I have actively opposed its use whenever possible. While her equation of woman and slave is again problematic, Wittig is doing something important here. It is not just that she was trying to convey that men as well as women were rebelling against patriarchy. She specifically describes a few instances of such gender treachery. Quote, a woman sings. At a given moment, interrupting her song, she falls down, she writhes about, she is racked by sobs. At once other cries, other sobs are heard. Behind the trees they discover a young man, prostrate, trembling in every limb, cheeks salt with tears, full of grace and beauty. Taking him in their arms, the women bear him to the side of the young weeping woman, applauding when they recognize each other and embrace. Then they express their satisfaction. They inform the young man that he is the first to have joined them in their struggle. They all embrace him. One of the women brings him a rifle, saying that she will teach him to handle it after the celebration they prepare in his honor. But Wittig's larger point was that this is a rebellion of people against patriarchy, all people, and therefore means the abolition of gender, which is always a marker of difference, the line that perpetrates an ongoing war. Quote, the women address the young men in these terms. Now that you understand we have been fighting as much for you as for ourselves, in this war, which was also yours, you have taken part. Today, together, let us repeat as our slogan that all traces of violence must disappear from this earth. Then the sun will be honey-colored and music good to hear. The young men applaud and shout with all their might. They have brought their arms. The women bury them at the same time as their own, saying, let there be erased from human memory the longest, most murderous war it has ever known, the last possible war in history. They wish the survivors, both male and female, love, strength, youth, so that they may form a lasting alliance that no future dispute can compromise. One of the women begins to sing, "Like unto ourselves, men who open their mouths to speak, 1,000 thanks to those who have understood our language, and not having found it excessive, have joined with us to transform the world." The people invoke the names of several goddesses of war from different cultures, Amaterasu, Chicotl, Aristikos, Minerva, as they prepare to fight. An example, quote, "They say, how to decide that an event is worthy of remembrance? Must Amaterasu herself advance in the forecourt of the temple, her face shining, blinding the eyes of those who, prostrate, put their foreheads to the ground and dare not lift their heads? Must the rays from her slanting mirror set fire to the ground beneath the feet of the women who have come to pay homage to the sun goddess, the greatest of the goddesses? Must her anger be exemplary?" This kind of gnomic, prophetic repetition is typical of the book's style and topic, a fantastical war set in a long ago and far away. For me, this fictionalization, this blatant construction, makes these references to archetypal goddesses not only acceptable, but moving. The mythology is all of one part. Goddesses have not here been appropriated to prop up someone's thesis or for an individual's personal identity. Rather, they are invoked as part of a common, presently created mythology of rebellion. The people in Wittig's novel also frequently discuss female anatomy and use it as a reference point for their experiences and struggle. While this is far from my favorite rhetorical device, the following passage shows their collective movement through and away from such references and towards a generalization of struggle. Quote, "The women say, the men have kept you at a distance, they have supported you, they have put you on a pedestal, constructed with an essential difference. They say, men in their way have adored you like a goddess, or else burned you at their stakes, or else relegated you to service in their backyards. They say, in doing so, they have always in their speech dragged you in the dirt. They say, in speaking, they have possessed, violated, taken, subdued, humiliated you to their heart's content. They say, oddly enough, what they have exalted in their words as an essential difference is a biological variation. They say, they have described you as they describe the races they called inferior. They say, yes, these are the same domineering oppressors, the same masters who have said that Negroes and women do not have a heart, spleen, liver in the same place as their own, that difference of sex, difference of color signify inferiority, their own right to domination and appropriation. They say, yes, these are the same domineering oppressors who have written of Negroes and women that they are universally cheats, hypocrites, tricksters, liars, shallow, greedy, faint-hearted, that their thinking is intuitive and illogical, that nature is what speaks most loudly in them, etc. They say, yes, these are the same domineering oppressors who sleep crouched over their money bags to protect their wealth, and who tremble with fear when night comes. This passage points out that the war on patriarchy is a war on essentialism, that essentialism is directed primarily along gendered and raced lines. Feminists who fearfully guard the garden of oppression fail to see that their opponents, when their opponents are pointing out their racism and transphobia anyway, are only calling them further down their shared political trajectory, not invaders, not occupiers, not appropriators, but comrades asking for camaraderie in return. Wittig's novel, a lyrical ode to what it might mean to revolt, illustrates that it is better to consciously make things up than to appeal to such broken kinds of authenticity.